Hi, everyone. Welcome to 2022 Women Data Science Puget Sound Conference. My name is Magsino, and I'm a manager of data science and analytics at the Spur Group.
And I'm Kristin Mussar, and I'm a data scientist at CGen.
We are the overall conference planning leads and your hosts for today, and we're so excited to celebrate this conference with you. Each year, we are astounded by the number of attendees that register for our conference, and wanted to first of all thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us in today's event. You'll see me, Kristin, and many of our other volunteers throughout the day as MCs introducing our speakers, leading networking breakout sessions in the WiDS Expo booths and in the chats. You can message us with questions throughout the day, and we're all here to support you. In the opening ceremonies, we'll give you an overview of what we have in store for today's event, give you a tour of our virtual platform, and we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Jaime Teevan. After our keynote talk, we'll then do a quick breakout session for some face-to-face interaction before we head into the technical talks. So get ready to meet some of your fellow attendees. WiDS Puget Sound is part of the WiDS initiative and is one of over 200 regional conferences worldwide. Our conference coincides with the WiDS Worldwide event, which was held last month. WiDS aims to inspire and educate data scientists worldwide, regardless of gender, and to elevate and equip women in a traditionally male-dominated field. As data scientists, we know that all perspectives need to be included when making decisions, large and small, using data. Having diverse perspectives helps prevent bias in these data-driven decisions. Yet women only make up about 18% of all data scientists, so we need to find ways to close this gender gap. The ultimate WiDS goal is to increase diversity representation by 30% by 2030. One way to do that is to get involved in conferences like this and groups like Data Circles by attending, supporting, volunteering, and spreading the word. Our conference is fully supported by sponsors, which allows us to host this conference for free for all attendees. And it's also fully run by volunteers, most of whom have day jobs and work on this conference during their evenings and weekends. This is our 4th annual conference and our 3rd year going virtual. Although there are some pros and cons of our fully virtual conference, one of the best things about being virtual is the number of people we've been able to reach around the world. This year, we had attendees from over 30 countries register for our event. This is something we would not have been able to accomplish if we were still a fully in-person conference. As I mentioned earlier, our conference is planned and fully run by volunteers. We started planning the conference last September and onboarded all our volunteers in November. Our group of about 30 volunteers is organized into 5 planning committees. Overall, if you count the number of hours our volunteers have put in, we'd estimate this to be well over 5,000 hours. So thank you to all our volunteers for making this event possible. If you're interested in becoming involved in future conferences as a volunteer, feel free to visit our WiDS Puget Sound Expo booth. Even though WiDS Puget Sound is a one-day event, you can participate in year-round events through our local partner, Data Circles. We would like to thank Data Circles for all the promotional platforms on social media and a great community foundation to build upon. Not to mention that most of our beloved volunteers are from this organization. You can join our community through the link on the screen. Data Circles holds a variety of events during the year for seasoned data scientists, those who are just starting the field, and those who are transitioning to the field. Despite the pandemic, we have been able to hold weekly journal club and book club meetings, as well as put on interview prep events. With the increasing return to normalcy, we are looking to revive our monthly tech talks and project circles. We are looking for volunteers to plan the project circle events. Good to note, all previous circle event managers and most attendees that completed projects have gone on to get jobs in the industry. So volunteer for these positions at datacircles.org/volunteer, or also visit the expo booth, Data Circles Expo booth in our expo area. Whatever flavor of social media you prefer, we are there. We send out regular reminders about our events on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as on our website. And definitely be sure to join us on Meetup to get up-to-the-minute information on all our events. And lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel to never miss any of our video content. Most of last year's conference talks are there, as well as content throughout the year. Today's talks will also be released here over the summer. Now I'll hand it off to Kristin to talk about what we have in store for our conference today.
Okay, so what's in store for us today? In addition to the awesome technical talks we have lined up, you'll have opportunities to network, to talk with sponsors, and win some great raffles. First up, networking. We know that virtual conference fatigue is real, and everyone is craving real connections in virtual spaces. That's why this year we have a number of networking opportunities. We'll start networking right after the keynote session with breakout rooms, so you can meet each other and get warmed up for the day. At 1:00 p.m., you'll have an opportunity for speed networking to meet attendees one-on-one for 5 minutes each. Accelerants will automatically match you with attendees you share similar interests with, so update your profile and put those interests in. At 3:00, we'll have topical networking sessions, and then we'll close out the conference with some additional breakout rooms. Additionally, we encourage you to reach out to other attendees throughout the conference to make connections, connect on LinkedIn, and to continue the conversations after the conference. So as you're sharing your awesome photos from the photo booth or any other experiences from the day, we encourage you to use our hashtags so we can see you and your experiences and maybe even reach out to you to learn about how your conference day went. Please connect with each other and with us on LinkedIn. So we've aspired to make the conference fun and engaging for all attendees. In doing so, we plan to give away 27 amazing prizes throughout the event. You can win these prizes by attending multiple sessions, attending a lunch and learn, visiting sponsors in the expo booths, and participating in networking events. You can learn more about the raffle rules in the lobby help desk. Raffles support businesses in the Pacific Northwest, and winners will be posted in the announcements section of the lobby just before the closing ceremonies. If you win, keep your eye out for an email from the networking team to schedule your prize, or to arrange your prize. We also want to thank our sponsors. So thank you to our platinum sponsors, CGen, Microsoft, and SAP Concur. Our gold level sponsors, Convoy, Expedia, and Shelf Engine. Our silver level sponsors, Liberty Mutual, Nordstrom, and Zoom. And our bronze level sponsors, Logic 2020, Surgical Science, and the Spur Group. It is thanks to the generosity of our sponsors that this conference is free for all to attend. So thank you, sponsors, for supporting women in data science and data circles. Now that you know we have all these amazing activities in store for you, let's show you how you can get places. The next few slides are also available in the help desk for reference. So the first thing that we ask you to do is to update your profile. This is so people can see you, talk to you, and learn more about you. So first you'll be asked to update your basic details such as your name and pronouns and where you work. Then you'll be asked who you want to meet and what your interests are. You'll be able to find attendees with similar interests using these interest tags in the People tab, and then these tags will also be used to match you with similar attendees in the one-on-one speed networking sessions. In the Privacy tab, you can set up your settings for how you'd like to be contacted throughout the day. And you can also set up your availability for meetings. So other attendees can reach out to you to schedule a meeting during the conference. And then something to keep in mind for the end of the conference, anyone you've made a connection with, you'll be able to go in and download that list of connections and their contact information. So it helps just keep track of who you've met during the conference. So this view is the lobby view. It's where you enter when you see the event. So it should look very familiar. The announcement section is where we'll post the raffle winners and any announcements throughout the day. So keep an eye on that throughout the conference. The gamification section is tracking interactions with the expo booths, and some of the raffles are based on this. The lobby chat is where you can post your introductions, tell us where you're coming from, and share your photo booth pictures. If you go to sessions, you'll be able to see the schedule for the day. You can bookmark the sessions you're interested in. And if you click on the My Sessions tab, you'll be able to just see the list of sessions that you've bookmarked. And we have a lot of talks. Often there's 4 talks going on concurrently. So please use the right arrows to scroll through and make sure you can see everything that's happening at that one time. You can also click on the session itself to bring up the abstract and details of the session. Our networking sessions are embedded into the schedule, so these will be hosted on Zoom in order to facilitate large breakout sessions. And you can see the Zoom link in the session description, so please join Zoom directly at the start of the networking session. You don't need to go into the Excel events session and then join Zoom. You can just go to Zoom directly. You can also view the schedule as a list if you prefer this view. And then also from the lobby, you can get to our help desk. We do anticipate if you do run into technical difficulties during the conference, that's okay, and we've prepared some tips for you in the help desk. Also, just some general tips, using Google Chrome is the preferred browser. It does tend to help quite a bit, and refreshing the page often can be helpful. So try those two things first. The last tab within our lobby is the photo booth section. So please visit the photo booth, take a great picture, share it with attendees. You'll be able to take a selfie, add a background, and choose some fun stickers. Please share it with us in the lobby chat and also on social media. So that's everything you need to know from the lobby. To visit our amazing sponsors, you can go to the Expo section from the left-hand navigation panel, and you can enter the Expo booth for a specific sponsor by clicking on their logo. So once you're in the Expo booth, you can message company representatives publicly in the chat on the right, or if you want to message them privately, you can send a specific person a private chat message. You can also set up meetings directly with representatives, and they'll be able to confirm or reschedule these meeting requests. If you go to your meetings section, so that's up in the top, kind of next to your profile picture, you'll be able to see all of your scheduled meetings, so you can keep track of what you have going on that day. Today, that is. And we also encourage you to meet other attendees, connect with each other, and set up times to meet. You can find a list of the other attendees in the People tab on the left-hand menu. So lastly, our last slide before we'll move over to the keynote is you might want to change your settings in Excel events. So you can set up your audio and video devices from the settings menu, and you'll want to set up your audio and video if you're joining a workshop or for our some of the networking sessions, such as the one-on-one networking sessions. And as well, in the settings tab, you can also change which notifications you receive throughout the conference. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Catherine to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Kristin. I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jaime Teevan, who will be giving our keynote speech, How Work Changed My Work. Jaime is a chief scientist and technical fellow at Microsoft, where she is responsible for driving research-backed innovation in the company's core products. Jaime is an advocate for finding smarter ways for people to make the most of their time and believes in the positive impact that breaks and recovery have on productivity. She leads Microsoft's Future of Work initiative, which brings researchers from Microsoft, LinkedIn, and GitHub together to study how the pandemic has changed the way people work. Previously, she was a technical advisor to CEO Satya Nadella and led the productivity team at Microsoft Research. Jaime has received numerous awards for her research, including the Technology Review TR35, Borg Early Career, Karen Spark Jones, and SIGIR Test of Time Awards. She holds a PhD in AI from MIT, a BS from Yale, and is affiliate faculty at the University of Washington. Jaime, I'll hand it off to you when you're ready.
Thanks, Catherine, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I love talking about the research happening right now related to the future of work, and in particular, why data science and the work that everybody on this call is doing right now is important to the future of work. So, as you're probably aware, prior to the pandemic, we were already in the middle of a pretty big technological shift in how people get things done, with the move to the cloud and the proliferation of edge devices and real advances in artificial intelligence. But COVID basically created a phase change, and it took this primordial goo that was ripe for innovation, and it provided the spark that enabled us to start to look at work with fresh eyes. And that's what I thought I'd talk a little bit about today. I basically want to talk about the shift that data science has been driving for the past several decades in how technology can help people get things done, and then the phase change that happened as a result of COVID forcing pretty much anybody who could possibly work remotely to work remotely. And these two things have fundamentally shaped my research, and actually even shaped the way that I personally get things done. So I'm sure, so hopefully there'll be some tips and tricks that you can take away as you think about remote work and returning to the work site, what hybrid work is going to look like. But in particular, I'm sharing this as a call to action, because data science is going to fundamentally shape the emerging hybrid work era. And it's collectively our responsibility of the folks on this call right now, not just to understand what's happening with this transition, but to actively and intentionally create a new and better future of work. So good. I said I'd start by talking about the shift that data science has been driving for the past several decades. And I thought, given that this is a group of, focused on women in data science, and I'm a woman in data science, that I would do it a little bit in the context of my own personal history. So the term data science came into existence in the mid-1970s, right around the same time that I came into existence as well. So Paul Nauer, for example, actually proposed the term data science in 1974, a few years before I was born, as an alternative name for computer science. As a baby, I didn't have any personal experience with data science. I didn't even have much experience with computers until the mid-1990s, when I was in college. And around that time, Chikio Hayashi, who's considered one of the founders of data science, actually introduced it as a new concept and started describing some of the different aspects that it includes, like data design and data collection and data analysis. And I started encountering sort of my first experience with large-scale data as well, and thinking about that. And I think that data science was really hitting the radar in the mid-90s for one particular reason, and that was the emergence of the web. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, I want you to think back to the first time that you encountered the web. I would guess a lot of you actually can't remember that because you were too young. In fact, actually, it would be interesting. You should share in the chat some of the ways, if you do remember seeing the web, and what that was like, and if you don't. But I remember it really well. I remember being in this dungeon of a computer science lab in my undergraduate institution, and this guy called me over and he's like, "Jamie, come here." And he showed me my very first web page through the Lynx browser. And at the time, the web was entirely text-based. You had to tab around between the different links, and you had to click return if you wanted to follow one of the links. And honestly, I thought it was really dumb. Fortunately, I wasn't too dumb to recognize that guy was someone special, and I ended up marrying him. We now have 4 children. But I couldn't figure out the web, and I wasn't completely off base at the time. It just wasn't that useful at the time. There wasn't that much content. It was hard to get around, but it did open the door for 2 key shifts. So the first shift that it created was it created this lightweight way for people to connect, so much so that we see real-time collaboration as a fundamental part of the software that we build. And we're only just starting post-COVID to really understand how online collaboration changes the way people work together. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in a bit, because this rapid shift to remote work that we've seen over the past 2 years has really changed the way that we're connecting via tools like the web. The second shift that the web created is that the web made it possible to observe people's interactions with software at scale. And You know how I thought the web was dumb? The thing that really made me stop thinking that was the emergence of web search. Basically, the content on the web becomes useful once you have the ability to search over it and find it. And in fact, I thought web search was so awesome that I went to work at one of the very first search engines right out of college. You probably don't know it. It's called InfoSeek. It was pre-Google. And then went on to get my doctorate in information retrieval. I like the Lord of the Rings reference in the chat too. So anyway, looking back, I can say that while I was right about search engines being transformative, I was actually totally wrong about why they were so important. So I was doing work on search engines because I was excited about creating this oracle to all knowledge where you could basically ask any question and you could get an answer. And we've made really good progress on that front. But what I was missing in my excitement was that it was really how this would happen that mattered. And the way that search engines have managed to get as good as they are today is through behavioral data and data science. You know, search engines see the queries that people enter and the results that they click, and they use that data to get better. And while this was new with search engines, it's now the way every piece of software is built. You know, the products that we build, all of us, the products we build, they engage people. And that engagement produces behavioral data. And we then use that data to create better products, and that in turn drives more engagement. And these feedback loops are driven by experimentation, where we use behavioral data to compare different experiences in A/B experiments. And more recently, they're also driven via artificial intelligence, where we actually take the data that we collect and we feed it back directly into the system so that it can learn from it. And the results of this have been amazing, right? I mean, the things that we can do now are phenomenal. We can find the most efficient route to drive somewhere by learning from other people's experiences with traffic. We can write better by avoiding the errors that other people have made. We can find awesome new music or cool videos to watch because other people like us have watched them first. But we're also increasingly seeing that these systems have second order effects as well that we need to understand. You know, an example that I find really interesting is the fact that these engagement-driven feedback loops often result in creating software that drives our attention. And with a bunch of women on this call, you might find this interesting. Did you know that people notice their phone is missing before they notice their wallet is missing? And even more relevant to us, perhaps, is that people notice their phone is missing before they notice their child is missing. And that may sound ridiculous, but I'm actually pretty sure that's happened to me before. And my 4 boys are really, really noisy. And, you know, your phone wasn't built to capture your attention. It was built to connect you with other people who are far away. But essentially, as the applications on your phone used your data to become more and more engaging, it accidentally became something that you just couldn't put down. And this interaction between technology and what people choose to do is something that's been really fascinating to me since my graduate school days. You know, pretty much no technology is neutral. The tools that we're building are always inherently impacting the choices that we make. And obviously paying attention to our phone more than we pay attention to our kids is a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way things are, you know, and as long as we're able to keep this realization that the tools have impact on people, we can focus on building technology that impacts us in a positive manner instead of technology that impacts us in a negative manner. And in particular, as data scientists, I think there's an opportunity for us to build feedback loops that put people at the center. Because while most feedback loops optimize for engagement, engagement is really not the end goal. The end goal is that people are successful, that they get what they care about done. And if we can capture people's goals and we can build systems that optimize for that, then we're not just creating technology that gets better with use, but we're actually creating technology that helps people perform better over time. So as an example of some of the work that I've done in this space, I did my doctoral thesis on personalized search and was really interested in trying to help people find information. Like I said, I was really excited about search and have spent a lot of time studying and building algorithms to connect people with information. And one of the things that I was really interested in part because of data science actually, is refinding and how people get back to information they've seen before. You know, something like a third of the queries that people issue on search engines are queries they've issued before or clicking on results that people have seen before. And because you've seen that information before, it leaves an impression on you. So those results that you've seen are going to influence what you expect to find when you run that same search again. But and you may not know this, I didn't know this initially. Search result ordering actually changes all the time as new resources become available or other things change, or even just the underlying ranking algorithm adjusts. And one of the things that we see when we look at the data is that when this happens, it slows a person down who is trying to refine something they've seen before. You know, so even if we, for example, take a search result that was at the bottom of the list and we move it up to the top of the list, that person's still going to find it slower because it's not where they were expecting to find it. They remember it at the bottom of the list, and that's where they're going to look for it. So the system is performing well. You know, theoretically, it's even performing better, but because of the impact that that system has had on a person in the past, the person is performing differently. And so you cannot just think of the ranking in isolation. You have to think of it in the context of the interactions and the influence and the way that people understand things. And we see this in particular in social contexts. So I did some work, for example, with Mary Morris and Brent Hecht a number of years ago, where we created a chatbot that we called Search Buddy. And the goal for what Search Buddy did was it would go identify people who were asking questions on social media and then auto-generate answers for them. There's actually a lot of times people ask questions and nobody answers them. And the goal was to help get answers to some of these questions. And one of the things that we saw that was particularly interesting was that the answer that Search Buddy gave didn't just provide information. It wasn't just finding these unanswered questions and getting them answers. The answer would actually influence the answers other people gave. I mean, the mere presence of an answer would encourage other people to give more answers, and then the kind of answer that it mattered as well. So if Search Buddy offered a link, other people might then start suggesting links as well. Or if Search Buddy said, oh, hey, you should really go talk to Kristin, the other people would start suggesting other people to talk to as well. And this suggests that there was an opportunity for Search Buddy to help people find answers to their questions, not just through the raw knowledge that it provides, but through the influence it exerts on others. And it's really cool when you start thinking about how you can use this fact in intentional ways. So, you know, we were talking about engagement-based systems, and engagement-based systems, unsurprisingly, encourage engagement. But what if you give the AI system a different goal, like something a person actually wants to accomplish instead? Like, what does that look like? And as an example of that, Long-Chi Yang, who's on my team here at Microsoft, he did his graduate work on this topic. He's an expert in recommender systems. And one of the things that he looked at was how you might account for a person's nutritional goals when recommending a recipe to them. So I don't know how many of you search for recipes online. I search for recipes all the time. Actually, I love to cook. It's one of my favorite things. And, you know, when you're searching for a recipe, the recommender system wants to give you a recipe that you're going to like. And obviously we all love, or at the very least, I love fat and sugar and salt. And so a recipe recommender system is going to recommend things like fried chicken and chocolate cake because they're delicious. But often our goal is not to just eat fried chicken and chocolate cake. You know, we like to eat food that tastes good, but we also want to eat more vegetables, or we want to eat less sugar or low carb. And one of the things that Long Chi found was that he could tune the underlying recommendation algorithm to give people recipe recommendations that met their nutritional goals without sacrificing how much they like the recipes that they found. And so my point with all of this is that the ability to observe people's interactions at scale has led to a really foundational shift. And that shift isn't just that it's enabled us to build better, smarter, more capable technology, but it's enabled us to build technology that influences people in ways that we can study and start to understand. And, you know, there's all sorts of enablers to this shift. You know, I mentioned earlier that the move to the cloud was pretty significant. It created this ability to collect and aggregate data at scale. The proliferation of edge devices like our phones and other kinds of sensors have also been really fundamental in that we can now collect new types of data from anywhere. We can have voice data, location data, GPS. We can have, you know, I can search for a question that I have right now. If I wanted to go recommend a good recipe app to somebody, I can, you know, search for that and answer it this moment. And also the real significant improvements that we've seen in AI and data science and the approaches that we're using for that, the ability to, you know, really operate over significant chunks of data as particularly important there. And that's the reason that we care about data science. That's the reason we're excited and we're here. But this shift was sort of plodding along, right? It was transforming some things like, you know, how I view my news feed or how I search for information, but it wasn't transforming some of the things that, some of the most important things that we do every day, like how people work. You know, we have a lot of inertia there. We have a lot of expectation. I talk about how, like, you see a search result at the bottom of the list and you expect it to be there. We have a lot of expectations about how our email systems are going to work, or how the things that we use to get things done are going to work. And progress was happening along this front, and it would have continued just sort of plodding along slowly if it weren't for what then happened 2 years ago when the pandemic hit. And for context, as Catherine mentioned, I'm currently chief scientist for Microsoft's core productivity products. And that means that my job is to use research to drive product innovation. And that's a hard task with such big, successful products. You know, things like Windows and Office and Word, they've been around for decades and people depend on them, and you can't just change them because something cool or shiny has come along or there's a new approach, especially when, as we've been talking about, especially when there can be unexpected externalities or can impact you in unexpected ways. But it was my job to figure out it is my job to figure out how to do that anyway. And I took this role about 3 years ago, shortly after doing a stint, as Catherine mentioned, working as the technical advisor for our CEO, Satya Nadella. And Satya asked me to take on this chief scientist role because it was becoming clear that that as hard as it is to drive this change, this shift needed to happen. Research and science were important to it happening, and it was just fundamental to the entire product building process that we get it done. And so I agreed to do that. And just as I was getting started, you know, I was asking you to remember where you were when you saw the web. one thing that I know we all remember right now is where we were back in March 2020 and what that was like. That's another interesting thing that I encourage you to share in the chat, what you remember that, and just reflect on it a little bit personally. Because March 2020 is probably seared in all of our ways. And it was terrifying in so many different ways. And it was, there was a ton of uncertainty. For me, one of the things that I thought was really scary, in addition to many other factors, was, whether this new made up role that I had just moved into would continue to exist. It's sort of hard to try and take something on new and then all of a sudden have a big change. Yeah. And Jenny, I had all sorts of experiences with trying to do with things that I thought were going to be in person and be like, oh, do we delay it a few weeks? Shocking to think that about the way that that's landed. For those of us in tech and the work we do, one of the things that's interesting, and we do, is big disruptions like the one brought on by COVID. They tend to be a time when many companies look to drive efficiencies. There's sort of two ways that companies deal with it. And one of that is to drive efficiency and get really narrow on what you're doing. And so it's not unusual for something like research to be seen as just nice to have. So I spent a lot of those early months worried that there wouldn't be a new job, a need for this new job that I was making up. That being said, it turns out COVID actually made my job easier. And I feel kind of like an evil person when I say that. But, because really the other way that companies deal with disruption, one is through driving efficiencies, and the other is by leaning in to innovation. And Microsoft has actually really doubled down on research these past 2 years. In the 15 years that I've been a scientist at Microsoft, I haven't seen such hunger to get research into the hands of our customers as I've seen recently. And honestly, that's because nobody knows what's happening with work right now. We're in the middle of the most significant change to work practices that we're likely to see in our lifetimes. And if you're a productivity company like Microsoft is, figuring out what's happening matters a whole lot. So we have a number of levers in place that we use to explore work, many driven by some of those data science shifts that we started out talking about. We have things like telemetry data and customer panels and survey instruments and studies of our own employees. We even run EEG studies of people's brains. And so in March 2020, when COVID hit, and everyone, all of us, we all became overnight unwitting participants in this giant, uncontrolled natural experiment into remote work, researchers from across Microsoft came together and started using all of these levers that we have and created what we believe is the world's largest research effort on post-COVID work practices. And it's exactly as Jen said, like we needed to be doing this studying because there have been immediate changes, and then there's going to be changes that don't show up for 5 years, and there's going to be changes that show up 10 years from now and even longer. And we need to be kind of putting all the focus we can on this. And you can find a lot of the results of the research that we do available online. I'm putting the URL in the chat at aka.ms/NFW. I believe it's the largest compilation of research into how work is changing. And you should keep an eye on that site because there's always new work being published. And in fact, in just a week or two, you can expect to see a pretty cool, significant report coming out. So check that out again next week as well. And this research is important because, we have to understand the change. We have to understand the long-term impacts of the change, which Jen mentioned in chat. And then also we have to figure out what kind of changes we want to drive, because our job as the people creating the software that supports remote and hybrid work, our job isn't just to observe how work is changing, but it's actually to intentionally create a new and better future of work. So when we look at the data, people often ask me, what's your biggest surprise that you found? And that's such a hard question. And one of the things that's hard about that question is literally the whole context is evolving so quickly, and something that's a surprise today is no longer a surprise next month. Next month we're like, oh yeah, we all know that. One of the things that we actually sort of take as a given right now, but was probably the first big surprise, is that it's possible to be productive while remote. And you'd be shocked at how controversial that was prior to the pandemic. Information work and information worker productivity, that's really hard to define and measure. There's some simple ways that we can do that to get an initial picture. Short-term metrics, we can use self-report data, we can use activity metrics. And when we look at that kind of data, we see productivity as staying stable in both. We released a big report. I talked about how we have a new research report coming out. We released about a year ago a big report that I'll also put into the, if I get links wrong in the chat, forgive me. It's hard to type links and talk. But I put into the chat a report that we released last year, aka.ms/NFW 2021. And there's a whole chapter in there on developer productivity. And I think developer productivity, when you think about how you're going to measure and see how productivity is changing over time, that's a particularly interesting area to look at for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that some of the work that developers do is measurable. You obviously don't want to do things like number of lines of code, but when you think about things like pull requests, that might be useful. We also at Microsoft have a ton of developer data. We have a lot of internal developers, and then we have a bunch of tools that developers use like GitHub and Visual Studio. And so a common developer activity metric, as I mentioned, is a pull request, which is basically a mechanism that a developer has to notify their team members that they've completed a feature. And across all of the studies that I've seen of pull requests, the number and velocity of pull requests actually increased slightly as we moved remote, while their size remained consistent. So, and you see this across pretty much anything that you choose to mention. We can look also more generally at information worker activities. In some ways, you can think about meetings as the pull request of information workers. I mean, that's a pretty crude approximation, but what is it that we're doing to get things done? And, worldwide, our telemetry shows that across all of our products, any type of information worker activity you might imagine was trending up. The average time that people were spending in meetings more than doubled. People were sending billions more emails each month. Basically, most of the work behavior that we were doing was becoming digitally mediated. And then that behavior was also increasing. So every meeting we sat in involves a computer now. Every conversation we're having involves a computer, and it's increasing. And it's really interesting to think about why this is happening and what's going on. Pandemic basically forced us to really lean into digital technology as a way to get things done. And space is probably the most important technology that people have been using throughout history to get things done. I mean, we've been using space for millennia. Face-to-face interactions drive just about everything we do. We use space to brainstorm when we sit around a whiteboard. We use it to get exposed to new ideas when we chat with someone in the few minutes before a meeting starts. We use it to get our burning questions answered when we barge into somebody's office and ask them something. So space affords collaboration, it affords spontaneous interaction, it affords serendipitous connection. And when space went away, it became harder to do all of those things. And we had to rely on digital technology to substitute for what we had been relying on space for. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is that in that process, space isn't the only thing we lost. Space actually helps to create important boundaries in our lives beyond just physical boundaries. So space, for example, creates temporal boundaries for us, because when we go into the office in the morning, that's when work starts. And when you come home in the evening, that's when work ends. It also creates boundaries between our work lives and our home lives, because, when I'm in the office, I don't have to worry that one of my kids is going to come barging in here and talking to me while I'm in the middle of talking with you. And so all of these different boundaries beyond space went away in this past year as well. And we've had to think about how we can use digital technology to replace them. And there's obviously a bunch of advantages to those boundaries not existing. After this talk, I'm going to go take my dog for a walk, and I'm thrilled about that. And I also really like that I don't have to wear shoes at this moment. But there are distinct disadvantages as well. Such as when I feel the need to work in the evening or take a call even when I'm on vacation, because I'm still in my home where I am doing work and I can, And so we see that in the data as well, where, people have clearly been working a lot more. So any increase that we saw, for example, in developer data around pull requests, it comes in two forms. There are two sources that you can actually look at. And we see more pull requests per hour. So that's people being productive and getting stuff done, probably in part because there's some advantages of having focus or being able to do other things. And the other thing we see is people working more hours. And that has a huge impact on well-being. And yes, Louisa, the not having to commute is a big one. And it's actually one of the biggest things people are complaining about as they return back to the office. I would say it's probably collaboration where we see a lot of the biggest changes post-COVID. So the sweatpants and the not having to commute and the figuring out your space at work, those matter. But really, it's thinking about how we connect with other people. And COVID has forced almost all of our collaboration to transition to being technologically mediated. And this really shows up in the data. So for example, I just put a link in the chat to a study that I ran with Sonia Jaffe, Sid Suri, Long Chi, Yang, and a bunch of others, where we were looking at how collaboration patterns changed following COVID. And I think this one's kind of a fun one to dive into because it's really an interesting data science study where we're using causal analysis to try and understand the changes. So the study compared anonymized collaboration patterns of two groups of people. One, Microsoft employees who worked remotely before the pandemic, and the other was employees who shifted to working remotely during the pandemic. And that was a total of, over 60,000 people. And because the collaboration activity of these two groups moved in parallel, it was different, but moved in parallel prior to the pandemic, we could then use causal analysis to subtract out any differences in the behavior between the two groups and isolate the effects of remote work from the effects of the pandemic. Because one of the things that happened obviously in March was sure, everybody, information workers, people who could move remote, moved remote, but also we had our kids come home from school. We had a lot of fear about health issues. There was a lot going on. And so we wanted to be able to understand that causal impact of the move to remote separate from those other effects. And when we do this, one of the things that jump out is that even though many of us have actually spent more time in virtual meetings during the pandemic, after we remove the effects of the pandemic via causal analysis, we see that firm-wide remote work actually caused a 5% decrease in synchronous meetings. And that's interesting. Remote work didn't drive more meetings. We actually see a lot more asynchronous collaboration. It drove more IMs. It drove more IM messages. And actually, you know, one of the funny things that I've found from the past couple of years is how much we're now talking about asynchronous and synchronous interactions. 2 years ago, when we first started talking about this, people kept pushing back and saying, Jamie, you have to find a more accessible word than asynchronous to use to talk about this, because that's just too nerdy for people to understand. But I will say, after doing remote work for a year, my kids started talking about their homework as asynchronous schoolwork. So clearly it's a concept that's so important that we've figured out how to talk about it. But back to the Nature paper that I was just talking about. In that study, another thing that we found was that the remote work increased the length of the workday by 10%. So the time between when people started working in a day to when they stopped working in a day increased by 10%. And, you know, that could relate to some of what we were just talking about more time working, longer work days. But it doesn't actually necessarily mean the total number of hours worked increased, because one of the things that happens, as we've been talking about, is like we're walking our dogs in the middle of the day, or having lunch with our family, or sometimes doing things that are hard, like teaching our kids or making sure that they get on to their class successfully. And so a lot of what you're seeing in that workday changing is partly because people started weaving non-work activity into their workday, which then makes asynchronous collaboration increasingly important, because it's not just something that we need to do to accommodate working across time zones, but it actually starts becoming something we need to do to accommodate working across different commitments and different ways that we're thinking, you know, different ways that we want to work. Another thing that the study showed is that while firm-wide remote work increased intra-group connections, you know, people's strong ties, it also showed that the share of time that people were spending with cross-group connections, or their weak ties, dropped by about 25%. So basically, we were sort of doubling down on the connections we have with the people we work with a lot, while letting those connections with the people that we don't work with, the sort of water cooler connections, atrophy. Teams are essentially adapting to do more loosely coupled work while remote. They were working in tighter groups with fewer dependencies across groups. And, you know, we can look at other studies to start thinking about what this means and how we can interpret those sorts of findings. You know, I mentioned the EEG studies that we've run, and one of the things that one of those studies show that I thought was really interesting and perhaps a little disturbing is that meeting people remotely for the first time is stressful. So you're going to go do networking events and meet people online, and that's gonna be good, and you should do it, but it's going to take out of you and be hard and impact your relationship. And you can really see that the cognitive load is greater when you're doing that when in person. So celebrate yourself for leaning in and doing that. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting is that initial remote meeting actually also impacts our future interactions. And so that higher cognitive load persists when you then meet the person in person for the first time. And that was a finding that really made me worried for my middle two boys who were just starting high school while everything was remote, because they didn't meet their classmates until 8 months in. And that's just just carrying, like, the cognitive load of starting high school is really high. And so carrying that additional cognitive load and knowing that it was going to continue to influence them even when they got together with their classmates, broke my heart. Fortunately, looking at the brain also provides insights into how we can alleviate some of these challenges. This goes back to it's our job to understand what's happening and to figure out how to make it positive. We find, for example, that together mode, which is in Teams, which is this mode where we can actually put people into a shared space virtually, helps alleviate mental effort. And so that's why you see lots of innovations like that have come to the fore in the past couple of years. And we see even things like 5-minute breaks between meetings is really effective at reducing the stress on our brain. And so now our tools are helping helping with that, I know Outlook, for example, makes breaks between meetings automatic, or will give you a warning when a meeting is about to end so that you can get off earlier. And in general, I think current remote meetings are a great example of the pros and cons of technology mediating the entire meeting interaction. And they're a place where we can start to use some of these techniques we talked about to really start iterating and learning and using data and people's experiences with things to make it better. So there's a ton of challenges with remote meetings. There's challenges with remote presentations. I miss not being in a room with you all right now. We lose a lot, but they also offer a cool opportunity to rethink meetings. You know, in some ways, this is the first experience at scale that we've all had with augmented reality. And it's cool to be able to see people's names and know who they are. I'm terrible at that. I cannot remember anybody's name, and now I can use people's names, and I know, and I love that. I like being able to have my notes. I have some notes to make sure I hit on key points up in front of me, and that would be hard to do in a situation as well. Remote meetings also offer new ways of engaging. So I know we're using the chat here. 70% of Microsoft employees use in-meeting chat. And we find that it's particularly useful for people who have less visibility, like women. It's a good way to take the floor without taking over the floor. I love it for large remote presentations because it's a way to reflect on what's happening, even as I'm speaking. You know, none of you would probably start going and saying things out loud right now, but there's this great forum for us to have a sort of a side conversation. And so there are all of these great opportunities, and you know, looking forward, like when I think of the way that we've innovated around meetings, that's pretty cool. And we're in this similar moment that feels like March 2020 in some ways, with a lot of less of the sort of large scale panic. But as workplaces are opening up and we need to figure out this thing called hybrid work, we've got a big, scary unknown that we need to figure out, and it's messy and it's complex. And we're all, once again, making a lot of decisions in a highly ambiguous context, and it's wearing me out. You know, Microsoft Puget Sound campus has recently moved into stage 6, which is fully open. And the days where I go into the office, I am exhausted. You know, I'll go in and I will spend the whole day on remote calls, and I will not know why I bothered showering and putting on nice clothes. And, you know, the worst is, like, I go into the office. I was in the other day, and I had a remote meeting that I had to get to. So I had to get to my office fast. And as I'm walking down, a colleague pops her head out of her office and she's like, "Hi, Jamie." And I'm like, "Sheila, it's so great to see you." But then I'm like, "Gotta go." And I went running off to my office. And the whole reason that I bothered to go in was to stop and spend some time to chat with people like Sheila. And I wasn't doing that. And our CEO, Satya Nadella, calls this the hybrid paradox, where, you know, we want the benefits of remote work and we want the value of in-person time. So we actually see in the data, for example, that 73% of people say they want the flexibility of remote work to say, but 67% simultaneously want more in-person time with their team. And when I come home and I'm exhausted at the end of the day, I just remind myself of how tired I was every night in March 2020 and April 2020. And you know, there were so many things we didn't know. I didn't know how to end a meeting. I was like, when will I ever find the time to go to the bathroom between meetings? I didn't know how to do any of those things. And we figured it out. And our technology got better, and our systems and our processes got better. And you know, that's the opportunity ahead of us. And the good news is that the work that we're doing, data science, can help make sense of this ambiguity. You know, prior to the pandemic, we already saw that the ability to collect and analyze and use data was transforming work. But the pandemic has accelerated this transformation in an unimaginable way. More work is digitally mediated than ever. And the need for that digital mediation to be valuable is more important than ever. And I really want to put a call to action out to this community to think about how the work that you do applies to the significant disruption in work practices that we're all living through right now, and to figure out how to make work better, make the future of work one we all are excited about. And it was a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for your time.
Wow, thank you so much, Jamie. That was a really great talk. I think it hits home for all of us when we're listening to how the world has changed and how it's affected us through this pandemic and how we work. Particularly for me, like it hits home for me a lot. I recently had eye surgery on both of my eyes, and I was like hours away from going completely blind about a week ago, actually. So I'm very surprised I'm actually able to talk to y'all today. But one thing that I've been thinking about for the past week is how like my vision, like how this whole thing is going to change how I need to change like how I work, because I spend like 8 hours a day in front of a computer. And then after work, I'll either work on conference stuff, so like a couple hours. And then once I'm completely done with the computer, then I'll go onto my screen. So like basically my whole waking hours is in front of a screen, either on a computer or on my phone. And so I just was interested in your insight on, is there any research or anything that has to do with like kind of looking into how the change and shift in the way that we work and interact with technology can potentially affect our health?
Yes, there's actually a bunch in what you were saying. So there's there have been studies that I'm not deeply familiar with the impact on health. Like another great example is I probably on a day I'm working from home, if I don't take the dog for a walk, I walk like 10 steps in a day. So and I certainly gained the COVID-19 pounds with the not walking and eating lots of bread. So yeah, I think we're going to see externalities related to that, and the impact on our physical health, the impact on our mental health. There's all sorts of complicated things that are coming that we need to figure out. One of the things that's not unrelated to what that I thought of as you were talking about too, though, is it is interesting. You know, we've also done a number of studies of folks with low vision or who are not sighted or other challenges, and the shift to remote work had a very differential impact on people. So I study personalized search. Like I assume everything is personalized and different, and that we should tailor things. So when like early in COVID, when people were like, oh, there's all this variation in the data, I'm like, of course there's variation in the data. And then I looked at the data and it's like, no, it's more variation. Like it's more variation than you would expect. And people have really different experiences. And actually one of the places where you see a lot of benefit is often people for whom the workplace isn't as well designed. So there actually are a lot of benefits for people who have learning differences or mobility challenges or issues with sight or hearing. They're technological challenges where sometimes our tools weren't really up to it. A great example is somebody who can't speak won't get highlighted on a Teams call or a Zoom call because that noise is what brings your video to the fore. But those are things that we can build and adjust. You certainly see women and people of color are much more interested in remote work. So I think there's interesting challenges there. I will say, I think we're going to see huge innovation as space starts opening up in devices. So you talked a little bit about being in front of a screen all day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been exacerbated with the move to remote work. As workplaces start opening up, business decision makers are deeply rethinking about how they use physical space. And I think we're going to see technology get integrated into the physical space in a way that doesn't look like screens. And that's going to be really cool. I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but it's going to be pretty interesting.
Great. We have a couple questions from the audience. First question from Kelly Dunn. Customers for your panel, sure they represent.
I'm sorry, that cut out, so I didn't get the question.
How do you select customers for your panels, and how do you your users?
I still missed the how do you ensure, but I got how do we select customers, and I'll talk a little bit about how we ensure some things.
Oh, how you ensure they represent your users?
Oh, that they represent our users. There's actually interesting things. I'm also putting a link to, and I think I'm typoing. Yes, I am. But I'm putting a link to John Tong at MSR, who's done a ton of work related to accessibility in COVID. So interacting with understanding customers is a core foundational priority for Microsoft. We think a lot about the customers we work with, and we have many, many different ways that we select customers for panels, or even think about the telemetry data that we look at and the way we so we have a number of different programs, from thinking about some of our largest customers to make sure we're on top of how they're working, to thinking of representative customers, to thinking about customers that that like us and leaning into that, to customers that don't like us and leaning into that. So I would say we pretty much do anything you could imagine. One of the things that I think is interesting related to this, how do you ensure they're representative of our users, is actually thinking about what we want them to be representative of. A great example here, I think, is if you think of VS Code and all of the deep work that they do to think about how to improve, and you run all sorts of A/B experiments, etc. There's but most developers are male. And so there is actually, and that is representative, the telemetry data there is deeply representative of how people are using VS Code, but it may be that we end up accidentally optimizing the tool for male developers. I think about that if you, actually this is an argument I have with my kids. I have five boys in my house, and they all are very warm-blooded and hot. So they like to keep everything colder, and I like to keep things a little more warm. And I talk about how, that's a challenge in the workplace, especially where, often women are colder at the workplace. And if you set the temperature at the workplace for the average person there, you might be actually making it a less hospitable environment for women when you want to invite them in. So I think it's really important to be thoughtful about both the customers that we have and thinking about aspirationally the customers that we're interested in. So one of the things, for example, that we're really interested in, talked a lot about information workers today, and folks who were able to easily move remote easily. I mean, it was not easy for any of us, but could take our jobs and move remote back in March 2020. A lot of people couldn't do that. About a third of US workers transitioned from in-person to remote. About a third were furloughed and stopped working, and then about a third were deemed essential workers and continued to go into the workplace. And one of the things that I think was really interesting is actually it really forced us to push on what work can be done remotely, and transition work that you might not have thought of as information work into information work. And so we're really interested in actually leaning into that and increasingly studying and supporting frontline workers and people, where technology can still provide benefit. We just hadn't fully leaned in there.
Great. I think we have one more room for one more question. So I'll pick one regarding the space construct. Have you studied the measures of worker connection to colleagues pre and post pandemic? How has that changed?
Yeah, so we have studied a number of measures for folks, and actually space and connections are well established. Like, it's well known that people who sit on the same floor collaborate more than people who sit on different floors, let alone in different geolocations. So there's there's huge. One of the things that was really interesting and sort of exciting about the pandemic is it did enable collaboration across geolocations in a new way, kind of took space out of the factor. And there's a bunch of emerging research starting to look at that. You know, is there more cross-university papers being published? Or I think of the New Future of Work initiative, which is where all this research I'm talking about today comes from. And I've only just started meeting a bunch of the folks who are involved in that research, and many people come from all over. And the fact that all of our meetings are virtual has made a pretty big difference. That Nature Human Behavior paper that I shared a link to earlier in the chat is probably what I think of as the richest study of how the shift to remote changed collaboration networks. As folks, one of the hard parts is now everybody's like, okay, hybrid's back, tell us how that works. And, you know, the challenge is we just don't have enough data there yet to really know how that works. And that way research actually lags a little bit. And, you know, we're in the process of running similar studies and trying to figure it out. We're leaning in a lot to try to see, you know, how to use space intentionally and what that should look like. But I don't have the answers yet.
Yep, that's good. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. This is such a fantastic talk. That probably could have had another session just answering questions that people have for you. But yeah, but really appreciate you taking your time this morning and talking to us, and hope you enjoy your walk with your dog as well.
Thank you.